Our next keynote speaker is Professor Donna. She is a Winthrop professor with the Faculty of Medicine, Dentistry and Health Sciences at the University of Western Australia and Australian Telethon Kids Institute. Professor Cross, where are they? Professor Cross' research is focused on how to increase students' mental health. Her most significant research contribution relates to her work on aggression and bullying among young people. She has been awarded enormous grants addressing child and adolescent health and well-being, which has supported 52 applied schools and community-based research intervention projects, investigating ways to enhance the social and emotional development and reduce bullying and other antisocial behavior among children and adolescents. She currently leads 9 3 to 5 years research projects that aim to enhance students' well-being, especially their social competence and other skills, to reduce all forms of antisocial behavior and mental health harms, especially among vulnerable school-aged children and adolescents. She, in 2012, received the award for Australian of the Year for her services to children's health and well-being. Professor Cross, the stage is yours.
Good morning, everyone. Your Royal Highnesses, friends, colleagues, and people who are just wonderful advocates for bullying prevention. I feel so honoured to be here, and particularly to be in Stockholm, one of the most beautiful cities in the world. And I'm going to show you another city that's just as beautiful to start. Because as an Australian, you can never begin your presentation without telling people a little bit about Australia. Now, of course, I'm sure you all know where it is. Of course, it's down under. And I'd like to tell you where I'm from. Most of you will know where Sydney is, perhaps, and I live over here. And later I'm going to talk to you about something that's up here, but you need to remember roughly where it is in Australia. And there's a lot to see. It's a very big country, and as you can see if you lay it over Europe, it's not a place you can drive around easily. And there's lots of open space. And if you can read that sign, it says that to get help for an emergency, it's 174 kilometres away. You need to be good at walking. So bring your own help. So bring your own swimming gear. It's a very nice place to relax. And of course, this is the Great Barrier Reef. But I need to show you my side of the country, which is Ningaloo Reef, which is just as beautiful. But very few people there, as you can see. And in case you forgot where that is, let me show you again. That's that little red dot. It's a very long way from Sydney, but worth getting there. In addition to that, of course, you need to see what you would see if you're at Ningaloo Reef. And this is a close-up if you were swimming in that area. And there's lots of cute things to see in Australia. And I'm sure you recognise the one that's on your right, which is a koala, but you might not know the one on your left, and that's native to where I live. And that's called a quokka. And that little one at the side is probably no bigger than about this height. So very worthwhile seeing. And I think I've just lost. You need to be very careful where you walk in Australia. There are many things that will get your attention. But while I'm showing you pictures of Australia, I need to show you pictures of my research team. Because the work that I'm going to talk to you this morning is not my work. I think to be successful, you need to surround yourself with amazing people. And these are the wonderful people who do that work. And one of those amazing people is here today, Kevin Runyons, and you might notice that he's the only male in this picture. We do have 2 other men on our team, but he's the one that showed up. Now, our team is incredibly enthusiastic about the sorts of things that we can do to reduce bullying. And over the last 17 years, we've been doing research that's highly applied. We're very enthusiastic to find out ways that we can deliver interventions much better than we've been doing in the past. In Australia, there's a lot of programs that are put into schools and very few of them have strong evidence behind them. And schools, to a large extent, trust that what they're putting in place will make a difference. So our research is focused on three main areas. The first is who we should target. So we've focused on different clusters of age groups to see what do we need to provide in the early years when children are perhaps first demonstrating aggression that might manifest into bullying as they reach older ages. We've focused on the middle years because in Australia and many other countries, more children bully around age 10 than any other age. And then we focused on the junior secondary years because, as many of you would know, that transition from primary school into secondary school can contribute to a significant increase in bullying, largely because of the change in organisation. We muck up their friendship groups. They have nice, stable friendship groups, then we put them into a bigger school where there are more friends and more other people to get along with, and as a result, bullying increases slightly, and that's an organisational change. We're responsible for that. So we've been very interested in how bullying changes over the life course. We also have spent time in more recent years focusing on higher risk groups, like our First Nation people, our Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. We've also been very interested in children who are experiencing chronic diseases. So how are they more likely to be targeted? The Royal Highnesses talked about children who are different and why children who are perceived as different are more likely to be targeted. So we've focused on groups who might be targeted for those reasons. And similarly, we've focused on groups who are highly engaged in bullying. So we have a study at the moment, in fact, Kevin Runyons leads that project, which is looking at children who are chronically engaged in bullying. Are we doing a good job with that subgroup? How could we teach schools and teach students and teach families to change the behaviour of the children who are perpetrating the behaviour, particularly children who are entrenched in that behaviour is some of the research that we're doing. We also focus on a lot of how. How are people delivering the bullying behaviours? And online is the most obvious one. In the last 7 years, we've had 6 projects that focus on ways of understanding how young people are using online environments and involving young people very much in each of those stages. And the what. Now, how do we build capacity? How do we lift the capacity of our schools so that teachers are better equipped to deliver content, that parents know the sorts of conversations they need to be having with their children, and that children feel empowered and have agency and competence and a strong sense of belonging so that they can contribute as well. And last but not least, and the issue that we all struggle with, and a project that I'll close with today, that was a 4-year project looking at how we scale. How do we scale the things that we know that make a difference? And how do we enable those things to sustain? So I'd like to take you on a journey as part of that, and I'd like to begin from a declaration. You think about why we're gathered here today. It's because we collectively think there's something that can be done, in fact a lot of things that can be done that will make a difference to reduce bullying. Well, 10 years ago a group came together, and I'm going to talk about that group in just a moment and look at how we've moved on in those last 10 years and particularly what's changed. And the areas that I'd like to focus on, as you can see here, are the influence of epigenetics. Now that we know, or are beginning to know, the ways that the environment influences the ways our genes are expressed, and particularly if we're in an adverse environment. And bullying certainly contributes to a significant amount of adversity. So you would expect a genetic change, not only a social change, an emotional change, but a genetic change, a biological change in the ways that, that bullying can affect an individual. I'd like to talk about the importance of the early years, and I'm not talking about junior primary school, I'm talking about from birth and the actions we should be taking that would enable and empower young people to resist bullying. I'd like to talk about upstanders as a word that really is relating to bystanders and the ways that we can engage with those groups and enable them to take more. I'd also like to talk about another change, and that's the right to be digitally forgotten. Do we have the right to be digitally forgotten? We're told that when things go online, they're online forever, so I'd like to talk a little bit about that change. And I'd also like to talk about the importance of engaging families and the roles that families can play. Schools are exhausted. We need families to help us, and we can't overlook them as part of the comprehensive approach that we would take to reducing bullying. And of course, last but not least, as I've already hinted to, how do we take this to scale? How do we do this in a sustainable way that makes a difference in the longer term? But before I do that, just to remind us all of what bullying is. I know you all know it, but let's just start from the beginning. And with lots of challenges, we've already talked about at the conference about how it's defined, but I'd like to tell you this is the way I'm thinking about it today. Bullying is when somebody says or does something, when somebody says or does something that's unintentionally hurtful and they do it once, that's mean. When somebody is intentionally hurtful and they do it once, that's rude. But when someone says or does something intentionally hurtful and they keep doing it, and that person is more powerful than the person they're targeting, then that's bullying. None of those behaviours are acceptable, but bullying is not accidental. It's heinous. It's deliberate. I've gone out of my way to do it. And of course, I do it again and again with more power. Now, using that definition, a group of wonderful people, and many of them are in the audience, and I'm sure you're looking for your picture right now. Wendy, I had trouble spotting where you were, but I know you were there. I'm looking hard to see. Peter Smith and others. We had this same opportunity where we came together, and this was, as you can see, the date, almost 10 years to the date. Quite opportunistic. I couldn't believe it when I saw the date. And we were hosted by Professor Alzaga. And at that meeting, we came together to say we have a pretty good understanding of what the evidence looks like at that point. And we put together a declaration. And I'd like to measure where we're up to now relative to that declaration and judge whether or not we've been successful. But broadly, that declaration said something along the lines of, we, the participants, and our names were mentioned, pledged our long-term commitment and determination to promote healthy relationships and prevent bullying and victimisation in children and in youth. And we went on in that declaration, I won't read the whole lot to you, and we made 8 statements about what we knew about bullying at that point in time, what we knew about the prevalence, the effects, the predictors of that behaviour, so that we could almost draw a line in the sand to say, well, this is our common understandings. What are we doing with that as part of our research? We also built into that declaration a call to action. So it's well and good to know all these things about bullying, but what are we going to do about it? What as a group do we pledge that we would do with our research? And you can see here very logical calls to action, that we would start early, that we would educate adults, that we'd target known risk and protective factors, that we'd promote healthy relationships, we'd monitor it, and of course we would involve families as much as we can. So I'd like to pick up on that declaration and see, well, where are we up to at the moment? So in that declaration, we made a comment that today, so imagine today, if we were able to go into every school in the world and find out the proportion of children who today report that they were bullied. And this is extrapolating data from children who report that they were bullied every few weeks or more often, so quite frequent bullying. There would be about 200 million children today, while we're doing this presentation, who are bullied. This is not a problem to be overlooked. And in fact, when I was thinking, 200 million, such a big number, what does that look like? Well, that's 2/3 of the United States. That's all of Brazil in terms of its population. And poor old Australia, it's 100 times the population of Australia, are the total number of children. This is an extraordinary problem. How could we overlook it? It would almost be a good thing if children turned green when they were bullied, so we would notice it and we would know that they're experiencing this outcome. Now, I'm not advocating that we encourage children to turn green when they're bullied, but it's important that we look for the signs and that we pay attention to it, because this is clearly a problem that affects many children and, as you all know, affects them for a long time. So that was then. What about now? Well, broadly, when you look at the papers that have been published in recent years, there doesn't seem to have been a huge change, although Paddy reported some data yesterday that suggests that perhaps there has been a decline. But generally, if we still said that that proportion of children are still being bullied, we haven't really made a huge difference. What haven't we sustained? What are we not taking to scale that could be delivered much more broadly? But more importantly, are we just focusing on those children who are bullied? Should we be focusing on the 2.25 billion other children who are younger than 18 years of age in the world and mobilising them? How do we change the social norms? In Australia, once upon a time, no one wore a hat. If you go to Australia now, pretty much everyone wears a hat. We've shifted the norm around sun safety. Around the world, we've shifted the norm around smoking. I'm sure many of you are as old as me and you grew up in environments that were full of smoke. These days, certainly in Australia, it's very hard to find people. I almost feel sorry for people who smoke because there's no place for them. We've shifted the norm. I challenge you that we can shift the norm around bullying. Get rid of statements like, it's just part of growing up. We can do that if we have a united voice and we come together to say we agree on these things and we want to take action to go forward. So our first challenge is how do we get that 2.25 billion people to take action? And many of them, as you know, are online, and we're asking them here to be upstanders. Now, some recent research that came out of our team, led by one of our PhD students, Lisa Patterson, looked at what do young people do online as upstanders or bystanders? And do they take action? Because a lot of the early research said it should be easier to be a bystander in online environments because you can help somebody without being so obvious that maybe you can send a text message when they are being bullied in Facebook so that you can get messages to them to say, it's okay, what can I do to help you? But when we talk to young people at length and ask them, well, so it should be easier, shouldn't it? And they told us a whole variety of things that are very different in that environment. For example, they said that because there's no authority in an online environment where there are rules and teachers and people who you can report to quickly, you feel less able to report or to take action, particularly if you were going to report to adults. And that online environment lacks so many rules that it's difficult to take action. I'm sure you thought about that as well. The physical presence, not being able to see the face of the person being targeted. Many young people said, I didn't quite understand the context of that bullying that was going on. Maybe it started with a joke. Maybe it is still a joke and I'm reading too much into it. So they felt that it was easier to judge whether to be a bystander in a face-to-face situation where you could look at somebody's face and see their response than it is in an online environment. They also said that context is really important. As I've suggested, no, they didn't really know what the history was of that event, and therefore they were much less likely to react. So if our challenge is to look at mobilising the bystanders or the upstanders, then what does this mean for our policy and practice? What is it that we need to do and sustain as part of that ongoing process? And this has come from your research and from ours. We need to understand what young people are doing online, and not just through self-report. There are lots of opportunities now for us to work with industry and ask industry to tell us what our 14-year-olds, 15-year-olds, whatever age group, what are they doing online? Because most industry partners have something called a VPN, a virtual private network. And those virtual private networks collect information about the places young people are going, how much time they're spending there, what they're doing in those environments. They're not allowed to reveal the pictures, for example, that they're sharing, but they could tell you that young people are sharing 8 pictures at 3 o'clock in the morning, which would give us the insight that perhaps at the moment we don't currently have. Another action that we need to be considering is to look at establishing social norms. Now, what is the normative behaviour? I mentioned before that we've shifted norms in other health behaviours. How do we shift them here? We need social marketing campaigns. We need people to speak out. We need organisations like the Friends, Royal Highnesses speaking out about the importance of taking action. That shifts the norm. This is not acceptable. And also normative expectations. If I want all of you to come for a run with me tomorrow morning, I need to convince you all that everyone else is doing it. In fact, you're one of the only people who aren't doing it. And I need to tell you that everyone expects that you'll be there. The 2 most powerful motivators of behaviour: social norms, normative expectations. I think everyone else is doing it, and I think everyone else thinks I should be doing it too. So shifting those norms with the sorts of educational resources that we have as parents, talking about it, teachable moments make a huge difference. We do this a lot, and I know there are many people in the audience as well, but engaging young people in every stage of research, but in this instance, for policy and practice, engaging them as social leaders. That if we want to make change, normative change, old people like us suggesting these norms is not the right way to go. We're not socially relevant, as sad as that sounds. We're not socially credible. But somebody 2 years older than me when I'm 14 is incredibly socially credible. So involving those young people as social leaders to drive this change will be key. And of course we need to lift community capacity. We have lots of people who say, oh, I just don't know what goes on in those environments. I don't need to know, but we do need to know. It would be like saying, I don't need to know what's going on in my country. Of course we need to know so that we can participate in it and learn from that experience. And involving young people in teaching adults is really key. So lifting our digital literacy makes a huge difference. There's our first challenge and a response. So the Candlestick Declaration, there's 5 of these, by the way, that I've picked out of this declaration. The Candlestick Declaration made comments about the impact of bullying. So initially I talked about the prevalence. Now, those 200 million children, what happens to them when they experience bullying? And the declaration goes on to describe what those effects are, but effectively they suffer. When we look at that now, and I've already hinted to this, we now have data that shows they not only suffer emotionally and socially, and we've always appreciated that there's been a physical element, particularly if they were hurt physically as a result of bullying, but we also know now that there can be a genetic change as a result of being bullied. And these biopsychosocial effects are things that we know much more about in the recent 10 years than we've known historically in terms of the impact on genetic expression. So our second challenge is that bullying can change the expression of genes. This is serious. As if it wasn't serious enough that we were affecting children in other ways, but now we have really good data that shows that this occurs. And it changes your DNA. So when you look at early life stress and how it modifies the DNA, what it does is it changes a segment of the DNA as a result of this toxic stress or this exposure to adversity. And we know that some levels of bullying bring a great deal of exposure to adversity. And there's probably one of the finest pieces of research that was done, as you can see by the reference at the bottom of my slide, was a longitudinal study with identical twins, which would be the only way that you could start to separate out the impact of genetics on, or the effects of bullying on genetics. These were identical twins, and of course they were matched, therefore, on their genes, but also on their family environment, so controlling for the 2 most important influences. They were discordant, so they had different experiences of bullying, so they selected out twins where one was bullied and where the other one wasn't. So I'm sure you can see that the design of this study was particularly good. And as you can see in the red third dot point there, that as a result of bullying and monitoring these children over time, they saw a persistent change, a significantly persistent change in the child's response to stress, and particularly at age 10. There were other findings in this study. So effectively what this does is it limits the body's response to stress, or the release of cortisol. And as you can see here, that of course is linked to really poor coping and mental health problems. So this is a significant challenge for us, and another important piece of information that we should be using as part of changing our normative shift to what we do. And I know you should have had a cup of coffee before you saw this slide, and I know it's a big screen. So let me just pull this apart. So imagine if we could create the ideal child. I have 2 children, and I would love to make sure my children hit that red box in the top right-hand corner. And that red box talks about the 3 factors that help children be most successful in their lives. So if we think about the pathway of adversity and the outcomes that might happen, this is the pathway of well-being. That if we were able to create an environment where children were exposed to the predictors, the things that we know that contribute the most likely outcome of them hitting that red box, this is what the research has shown is there. Now there's a lot on there, so let me highlight a few for you. And not surprisingly, the factors that contribute a lot of this variance, this explanation to hit that red box, are related to relationships. Positive relationships with peers, positive relationships with adults, and with peers, not same age peers. Schools are such an unnatural place because children spend all of their day with people exactly the same age as them. So what does it mean for practice? Children need to be mixing with children older and younger as part of their school day, so they learn skills to interact with people other than those exactly the same age as them. And they must learn to talk to adults. And you think about the use of computers and other devices, that perhaps we are reducing the likelihood of children communicating with adults and communicating with their peers in ways where they're looking at each other's faces. Of course, responsive parenting has to be another key relationship that contributes to that red box. This serve and return relationship. When a baby smiles at me, it's so important that the parent or the carer or anybody in that environment smiles back, because that builds the fundamental structures that a child needs to develop in other ways. And the last area, all of these are important, but these in particular, the ability to self-regulate. If I'm someone who gets upset a lot, one, I'm perhaps more likely to be a target, but I'm hard to be around. So I need to learn to regulate my emotions so that it helps me to interact with others, and lots of other factors related to regulation. So this might be this kind of a pathway that we would ideally like to see children follow. And sometimes in our bullying research we focus on what not to do versus what to do. And this is the pathway of what we need to do, the environments that we need to set up for children so that they have the best possible outcome, and the ability to relate and get along well with others as part of that. So given this knowledge about epigenetics and the impact of adverse environments versus positive, healthy environments on a child's development and their likelihood of having good quality relationships, which we know are highly protective against bullying. If I have lots of people around me who care for me, I'm less likely to be targeted, and if I'm targeted, I get a lot of support so I can deal with it much better. What does this mean for policy and practice? Well, it means that there are subgroups in our community who are more disadvantaged than others, vulnerable populations who need more support. So our bullying approaches can't be bland. They can't be cookie cutter. It's not the same for all children, so our programs can't be the same for all children. We need to be showing schools how to adapt and how to select out those aspects of the bullying interventions that will make the most difference for the children that they're experiencing, which means that schools need to have tools that help them to work out what children's needs are. Sadly, many bullying programs operate on a vibe. The school feels pretty good. But do we really know specifically what our children's needs are to improve their social and emotional development? I was originally a maths teacher many years ago, and if I went into a maths classroom and I ran my maths lesson on the vibe, everyone seems pretty happy. They seem to like maths. Let's just keep going with what I've been doing. But of course, we don't teach that way. We work out the needs of children and we make sure that we're delivering content to suit the needs of those children. And I'd argue our bullying prevention programs need to do the same. We can't assume that one program will have the same effect for all children. And therefore we need tools and ways to know how to adapt that. And of course, we need to be doing much of this work to reduce adversity and impact on genetic outcomes. It happens throughout adolescence, but particularly before age 4. So I commend the work that you have going on in Sweden. I always feel so proud to come to Scandinavia to see the investment that your countries make in the early years from birth, which many countries like Australia could learn a lot about how to support children from such a young age. This early intervention needs to help link to services. Often when we find children who have difficulties, it's hard to get to services that will help those children. If we have children who are showing early signs of autism, for example, we need to connect them as early as possible because they're very likely to become targets of bullying and maybe engage in bullying themselves if they don't get the appropriate help. And we need to go where parents are. So often we have that challenge. Now, how do we engage with parents? In a study, I worked in the US for 5 years in New York, and one of the most important places we went to find families, particularly disadvantaged families, was at the laundromat. Go where the parents are. Put messages where parents are, rather than trying to bring them to the school or make them come and join you where you are. And last but not least, if we want to make a change in this area, we need to engage the community. This is not a school's problem, this is a community problem. And you often hear, and I certainly have heard it sadly in some schools, that it's too late, we can't do it. How could we possibly make a difference when you look at the homes that these children come from? But the answer is, you can make a difference. There's quality research. There are researchers in the audience here who've done some amazing longitudinal work that show the impact of a good quality school environment for a child who comes from a home where they're experiencing great difficulties. So we need to extinguish that perception that we can't make a difference, because we can. The next part of the declaration, so we've talked about prevalence and severity, and now I'd like to talk about the ways that young people engage in bullying. And at the time, 10 years ago, we said bullying has many faces, including the use of emerging technologies. And you can only imagine 10 years ago, they were just emerging. They're well and truly emerged now. So now, of course, the use of technology is fundamental, and obviously it's part of children's social development. We're told by the young people who we work with, when we use the term online and offline, they immediately know we're old. Because for them, there is no online and offline, it's life. It's seamless. So it's part of their social development, so we need to work with them to understand that and help them to use that effectively in the same way that we help them to build their social skills in face-to-face environments. So our challenge here is we know very little about being online because of our age. I'm 57, so I'm a long way out of touch with what young people are doing. For example, how many of you could translate this? Do your best. It's not a test. This is what they mean, apparently. And it's different in different contexts. And it's not our job to be able to understand and read all of these acronyms, but it is a message to us that there is a world that we need to understand better. I quite liked kissing. I thought that was quite interesting. You too might like to build these using your keyboard. So we can't work in this environment without having young people involved. And we've been very fortunate that in Australia, and particularly over the last 10 years, in almost every research project that we've done, we have young people as co-researchers, co-designers, co-implementers, and co-evaluators. And so they give us insights that we would never have had. In a way, I criticise myself for my arrogance in the years prior to that, where we would build these programs and go and test them, and we would write them. And clearly, we don't know where young people are at, and we certainly don't know where young people are at in online environments. They told us, for example, that group that you just saw a moment ago, and there's many of them, we have different groups for different studies. They told us the sorts of issues that they thought were really important in online environments. So we have a study that was completed a number of years ago. It was called Cyber Friendly Schools, and it was an add-on to our Friendly Schools. We have a comprehensive intervention program that we've been studying for many years called Friendly Schools. And when the cyber elements were coming through our surveys, we knew we needed to add into that comprehensive program some cyber-related content, but we didn't know what we needed to add. So young people came up with these 5 Cs, and they said, well, you need to know about the context, the places where they're spending time, who they're spending time with, the contacts, privacy, confidentiality issues, the sorts of things young people are doing online in terms of their conduct, and the content. What are we looking at? What are the things that we're seeing? What are we uploading? What are we downloading as part of that? And our cyber-friendly schools use that content. The content there is not so relevant necessarily to other countries, but I'm using it as an example of the sorts of ways that young people have been able to help us to address this challenge that we know little about the online environment. In fact, they said to us, do nothing about us without us. Now, how is it that you could create a program for us, particularly in a space we know better than you, and not take action? And they told us, for example, about the sorts of experiences they have online and which are the most hurtful. And Peter Smith has published many years ago with great insight that, of course, images and videos of young people being used are the most hurtful. And this was reinforced through much of the work that we'd been doing. And as a result, we focused on that image sharing. So if putting pictures online increases the risk, what should we be doing that would help young people make better decisions in the moment that they upload, particularly given that their prefrontal cortex is not well developed, which means they're not thinking about consequences. They're very less likely to process the sorts of outcomes that might happen as a result of many of their decisions. So those young people and many other groups, in fact, you can see some of our young people here and suggesting the ideas back to us that they've come up with, helped us design an app. And the app is available. Apparently it's not available outside of Australia, so if you are wanting to go to the App Store and find Image Up, it is free, but only if you're in Australia, apparently. We're working on making it available more broadly, but it's an Apple and Android app. And the point of this app was we gave children a wicked problem, and we said, our challenge here is you like uploading images. How can we help you do this more safely? Because those images could be used later to harm you or to harm someone else. So we needed them to pause before they upload an image. They take a picture and then quickly they're sending it off to all of their social networking sites, for example. We wanted them to just take a few seconds to think about what they were doing. So we gave those young people this challenge. And they came up with many ideas. In fact, they created 10 apps, which we combined into one. And they designed a way to get children to pause when they're sharing. Now, you might say, who would put this on their phone? Why would any young person want to slow it down? Well, at the time, we designed the app so that when somebody took a photograph, it could be sent to every one of their social networking sites at the one time. Now, you might say that sounds very counterintuitive. Why would you want to encourage children to send it to multiple sites? What we were doing was gatekeeping. Every time a photo came onto a phone, it went through this app. And before it went to all of those sites, young people would get a pause. They said 10 seconds was all they could tolerate. And in those 10 seconds, they saw messages that they created that were telling them the sorts of things that they say to themselves after they've sent an image. They go, what if my father saw me? What if I sent that to the wrong person? And they did it in very amusing ways to get them to think about, or to have that pause, to engage a very limited prefrontal cortex in thinking about consequences. And then they could make a decision as to whether to send it on or not. They also came up with, and you can see this is taken from the app, the send it instead, this one over here that you can see on this side. There was also a library where they said sometimes when I'm sending images it can be really scary because somebody's wanting an image. I really care about that person. For example, maybe they want a nude or a semi-nude image sent. My boyfriend or girlfriend might want that. And I don't want to send it, but I feel great pressure. And I feel normative pressure because everyone else is doing it. And I think everyone else expects that you would do it when you're in a relationship. In Australia, for example, it's second base in a relationship. So the young people told us, second base. So we said, well, what's the first thing you do in a relationship? They said, well, you start talking to each other. And if you've got a thing, that's their word, then you exchange pictures. Second base. Third base, you kiss. So that exchange of pictures is very early in their relationship and it could put them at great risk. So they said they wanted to have something that they send instead. So there is a library that they can go into where they can select a message to send back to somebody who's asking for an image that they don't want to share. And that message might be something like, I'll send you a picture of me immediately after my dad sends you one of him. So the message is clear, I'm not sending it to you, but keep it light. So we've still got a friendship as a result. So getting young people to design the interventions that we create. This app, by the way, was part of a broader series of curriculum. It was linked back into our comprehensive friendly schools program and into our cyber friendly schools program, and was part of an overall education program, but delivered and designed by young people. They are so clever and so creative and so willing to be engaged and to share what they want. So we know little in this environment. That was our challenge. What does it mean for policy and practice? That we need to acknowledge that the online environment is a great place for young people. If it wasn't, they wouldn't be there. If we continue to damn it and to say they shouldn't be there and to block them, all we do is push them into subversive behaviours. We need to be helping them and educating them. We need to think about the online environment the same way we think about swimming pools. We protect children so they don't drown in them, but we don't stop them from swimming. We teach them how to use it much more effectively. We create an environment where they can do it safely. And that's the sort of thing that young people have recommended are important aspects for our policy and practice. We need to engage authentically with young people, not tokenistically. Often when young people are or asked to be involved in programs in schools, they are appointed and told the way that they should behave, instead of having ownership and really being able to deliver on the outcomes that they think are most important. And of course coming up with great outcomes like they have for us. We need to help parents to recognise the role that they play in how they communicate with their children about online environments. And most importantly, we need to help young people be leaders in this environment and to shift those norms in the same way that I talked about the social leadership earlier on. I'm nearly done. So next, in addition to the modes and the ways that young people are engaging online, the Candice Declaration talked about the rights of children. And as you can see, one of the most important rights in the United Nations rights for children is that every child has the right to be respected and safe, and bullying is a violation of this basic right. Of course, nothing has changed around that right, but there are additional rights that we need to be thinking of that are particularly important when it relates to bullying. And another right from that wonderful document is that children have the right to privacy. And in my language at the end, have the right to be forgotten. Know that when they put things online, it's there forever. Where do we give permission for that to happen? So how do we give children the right to be forgotten in what they put online? And the second right that I think we need to be including in the bullying intervention programs that we have is that children have the right to say what they think should happen when adults are making decisions that affect them, and that their opinions are taken into account. And you could see earlier when I talked about the authentic engagement of young people would be a way that we would be delivering that outcome for young people in that environment. So here's our challenge from those new rights. In addition to the work that we're doing to support children's rights, is to look at the right to be digitally forgotten. Now just think about the use of online environments and the likelihood of making a mistake in an online environment. Now, I know that use of Twitter, by the way, is declining for the first time, and only recently. And the most recent data that I could get for this slide is November 2016. But look at the rate of increase from 2009 through to 2016. In 2009, in January, there were 2 million new tweets per day. And in last year, just at the very end of last year, there were 500 million tweets per day. So wouldn't you love a share portfolio that increases at that level as well? So that's 6,000 new tweets every second. You can do the maths to work out how many tweets could have gone on during my presentation so far. So a 1 in a million chance, that's pretty rare, isn't it? You think 1 in a million. Often people use that phrase in English, 1 in a million chance. Well, in an online environment, a 1 in a million chance happens just in Twitter 500 times a day. So you just think about the scale of online environments and the likelihood of a child making a mistake. The digital right to be forgotten. Oh, by the way, Katy Perry has the most Twitter followers. I thought you might like to know she's got 87 million. If we want to make a change, we need Katy Perry on our side. When we think about this right to be forgotten, this loss of privacy can also happen through the contacts that young people have. And you often see them having thousands of friends in Facebook, or even more, thousands and thousands of followers in Instagram. And we found in our research, young people told us that you're more likely to accept randoms, they're people you don't know, if you're using Instagram and having them as followers, than you are having them as friends. And it's just all about the word. Katy Perry has followers. It's a fan club. I want a fan club. I'm more likely to accept randoms, certainly Australian children are, if they are using or accepting randoms in Instagram than if they are in Facebook. So what does that mean? It means the likelihood of them sharing information about themselves to people that they don't know, if they haven't set their privacy settings well, is considerably higher. And particularly when you look, again, these are Australian data, so a big oops. Nearly a quarter of 8 to 10-year-olds in Australia accept randoms, and over half, well over half, of 12 to 17-year-olds accept randoms. So their risk of sharing something and the digital right to be forgotten, again, is extraordinary. The next challenge is, of course, they love to upload and download. So when they're uploading images, and I know that this audience would be aware that the images that they take on their smartphone are very often geotagged, which means they hold the GPS location of the photographs. Where do most people, young people and adults as well, take photographs? In and around their home. So their address is often embedded in the photographs because the GPS location. And they may not have their address in a social networking site, but they may say in that social networking site that this is a picture of my cat in the kitchen. So they're hinting that this GPS is my home. So again, giving away information that they might otherwise not do. And for young children on mobile phones, they should have their geotagging turned off. But it's also an issue for adults too, perhaps, with how much they share online. There are also, that's uploading. Now downloading, we download apps. And many of you would have many apps, I imagine, on your phone. Young people have even more, thousands in fact, some young people. And when you look at the proportion of apps that draw out information from your phone, like your GPS location, your phone numbers, email contacts you have in your phone, and an example of one of those apps is Angry Birds. I'm sure most people would have heard of that app. That's an example of an app that takes information out of your phone. So as a result of downloading, so you are giving away information. In fact, we use the line, if it's free, you're not the customer, you're the product. If it's free, you're not the customer, you're the product. So, of course, these environments want to draw information out of you. So losing privacy is the way they're designed, largely. And by the way, there are some highly clever but terribly wicked people who collect information that people tweet or that they have in their online environments with their randoms and post information. This person looks like they're not home. This address, and they appear to be in Europe or wherever they might be as a result. And so the website, Please Rob Me, is a collection of places that you might consider burglaring. What does this mean for policy and practice? The digital right to be forgotten. Well, it means we need to understand what young people are doing so that we can help them. And again, working in partnership with organisations that are collecting this kind of information in addition to the work that we do is important. We need to show young people how to alert themselves to things about themselves online. They need good digital literacy and hygiene. How often do you digitally search yourself? This is not a narcissistic recommendation, but do you know what's said about yourself online? And do you search in different ways? Do you search in ways other than in nice search engines like Google? Do you use things like Dogpile, which searches in quite different ways to the ways that Bing or Google might search, and the ways that things might appear as a result? So being able to build a really positive understanding of what's going on online and being alerted, having a Google alert that tells you every time Donna Cross, her name, appears online is really helpful because it's a heads up that I need to be doing something to address that. And of course, young people having skills in this way would help them to understand what's out there and take action. And in Australia, and I'm sorry I don't know if this is true for other countries, but we now have a very strong regulatory mechanism that helps children to be digitally forgotten. We have an e-safety commissioner. And if a child is experiencing some difficulties, or an adult, they can contact the e-safety commissioner to have whatever they have online taken down. And assuming it's a Facebook or a well-known site, the e-commissioner and the government has control over taking that away. Nearly done. So the Cantersteg Declaration went on, and it said, in addition to protecting young children's rights, is that we need to engage with adults, and we need to make sure that adults have good skills, and particularly families. And I would argue that we haven't done a good job. In the last 10 years, I don't think we have really engaged with adults in the way that we should, and particularly to help them to know how to prevent and promote. We've perhaps only focused on protection. But we need to be educating parents in how to enhance the environments and the experience that their children have. So our final challenge here is, how do we engage with families better? And what should we do to address that? Well, many of you would be well aware of the literature that talks about the importance of families, that if we overlook them, we overlook one of the most important mechanisms we have to reduce and discourage bullying behaviour, and particularly one of the most important opportunities to enable and encourage bystander behaviour, because every child is a bystander or potentially upstander. We know that that it's key to a child's development that they have good social skills and that good peer relationships and the ability to regulate their emotions. And we also know that when parents are overprotective, or if families are experiencing lots of difficulties, that can influence the likelihood of the child being victimised or the child engaging in perpetration. So what should parenting look like? Again, you know this well, but how do we build this and encourage and enable parents, particularly parents who have difficulties, who have difficulties in their own environment, to remind them of the importance of warmth and responsiveness and support with authoritative but positive expectations of their children. Not authoritarian, but authoritative, setting high expectations and encouraging and lifting their children to ones that their children can achieve, and particularly improving their communication. We've been engaged in a number of projects, but one in particular called Friendly Schools, Friendly Families. And in that study, we were particularly concerned about the penetration of a family. That often, and this is true for Australia, and please judge if this is true for your country as well, when we send things home to engage with the family, we often have the mother who takes control of that piece of information, does whatever is required and sends it back. So it never gets into the family or past kind of a gatekeeper mother. That's not always true, but generally that's been true for us. So our challenge was, do mothers and fathers, or do carers, whoever the carers are for the children that we're working with, do they have similar attitudes about how to address bullying? And in our baseline surveys for this study and others, we found that when we collected data from both mothers and fathers, that often they had very different views about how to deal with bullying. Very often in Australia, mothers would say, walk away, ignore it, go and get help. And very often in Australia, fathers would say, fight back, step up, a more aggressive response. So our challenge was, if we keep working with mothers, we're not changing another influence on the child's life, or the male carers in the family. So in this study, we worked hard to get to a male in the family. So if the family didn't have a father who was present, we encouraged the child to talk to an uncle or to a grandfather or some other male in their life. And in this study, we worked hard, it's recently been published, to see if we could change the quality of communication that the male carers in the family had with their children about bullying, and similarly maintained and increased female carers' contribution. And we found that we were able to make that difference, but we needed to have gentle touches and lots of really positive communications, which I'll talk about in terms of what it means for policy and practice. That we need to do everything we can to open up those communication patterns. So some of the activities that we did in this study, for example, were to send children home with an interview. So they had to go and talk to certain members of their family and interview them about different things that we were addressing as part of our social skill development, and talk to parents about if they ever observed bullying, what did they do, and actions that they would take. You can imagine the sorts of conversations that we were trying to enable, so that we were trying to create a teachable moment for children and their parents. We need to be really clear. The fathers in our study said, okay, I need to know if I've got 3 or 4 minutes with my child, what are the 2 or 3 most important things that I need to be saying to them? Whereas generally the mothers were saying, look, give me all the information and I'll do best with as I could. But the dads wanted really clear messages. What are the 3 or 4 most important things that I should say? So even targeting and adapting our interventions to make sure that we're talking to the needs of adult carers was really important. And of course, finding creative ways to engage with parents. If you want parents to learn stuff, you might ask them to come to the school. So let's assume you're the parents of a school that I'm working with. We certainly wouldn't have this many people here, and anyone who does parent presentations would know only the parents who are already doing a great job come along to parent evenings. So how do you get to the other parents? I mentioned laundromats before. I'm not suggesting we should all be running out to laundromats, but child's performance is a great way to bring a parent into the school. If children are part of an assembly, are part of a performance, music, dance, whatever that might be, parents are much more likely to come. So what we did, for example, in primary schools, we built a whole series. We engaged with musicians and we wrote music and we wrote plays that had a very strong but subtle bullying message and modelling the sorts of actions that parents should take. There's another way that we could try to communicate to parents in ways where they would largely get engaged. And last but not least, what does it mean for policy and practice? That we need to really strengthen communities and for communities to recognise that they take a role. We had a study just recently where it was funded by a women's clothing store. I don't know if this store exists in other countries, but this store is called Supre, and it targets 13 to 16-year-old girls. And they took on the issue of covert bullying, and throughout all their stores and associated with the clothing, they asked us to help them create messages, which we're now testing to communicate these to daughters and their mothers while they were in that environment, because every 14-year-old needs a credit card to follow them into the stores. So it was a way to make sure that we were able to engage with parents. Similarly, engaging with NGOs, so non-government organisations outside of the school. In Australia, we have an organisation called Headspace, and they're often a referral organisation where if schools saw a child having a problem, they would refer them out of the school to this very large organisation. There are 80 offices around Australia, for example. We needed to improve the way that Headspace addressed bullying with patients or clients that they saw, because largely that organisation was not skilled in doing that. So these are examples of ways that we've been able to look to the wider community to address ways to engage with families, because families often come to these external groups in ways that they don't necessarily come to schools where we can impact on them. So my final challenge: if we got all of these things right, and if we really could create the utopic program that had the ability to be discerning and deliver content to children as is needed, how do we scale it? So a study that we finished a few years ago was a 4-year study looking at the quality of implementation of bullying interventions. So we took all our best ideas that we'd learnt since 1999 and pulled that into one program, and we worked with schools and we said, do with it as you see fit, naturalistically. Here are the resources. We then coached them in working out which aspects of the resources might be helpful for them. So rather than saying, get rid of everything you're doing to address bullying and put this program in place, we gave them a tool, and this tool was called Map the Gap. And what this tool did was to say to the schools, we think you're doing some great things already to address bullying. Don't stop them because they're institutionalised. They're already well embedded in your curriculum. But there's probably gaps that would make up a really good quality comprehensive program. This tool will help you work out what you're doing really well and affirm that, but also help you work out where your gaps are so that you can then cherry pick from the resources we've provided to fill those gaps so that you have a comprehensive program. And we found that that was a much more successful way to firstly get schools to engage, and then much more likely that this would sustain over time. So within these case studies that we tracked for 4 years, we saw some significant changes both at a student level and at a staff capacity level. But what was really interesting are the recommendations that came out of that. And I'm just going to close with 3 more slides that just come from these schools and the recommendations that we learnt from ways to improve and sustain the likelihood of our resources going into play. Now, the first of these is that schools are not happy, certainly in Australia, to be doing a bullying prevention program. They want to do a wellbeing enhancing program. So to sell our program to schools, to sell initiatives around addressing bullying, we needed to wrap them into the context of wellbeing, because that's a sustainable structure in schools. And it's so easily done because the work that we do is part of building a positive wellbeing. You saw that from that crazy diagram that I showed you earlier on, that we have a really important contribution to wellbeing, an important place. And if we show schools where it fits into their wellbeing program, again, it's much more likely to sustain. And you can see that the school principal said, you can take on programs and do them as add-ons, but they don't change the culture of the school. You really need to make them the pastoral care fabric. Pastoral care is wellbeing in Australia, in the school. So it needs to be part of the culture. That's how we sustain it. And building it into wellbeing makes a difference. The second thing that we learnt is that schools need local data. That just to take it on because bullying is a problem and 200 million children around the world are affected is not enough to get that change. Teachers need to see that it's affecting those children in my classroom and which children they're affecting. And we found that if they knew that, if they had local data, they were much more willing at a cross-school level. Teachers were much more likely to buy in and feel like that they had ownership if they could see that it was their children that were being affected, the students that were in their school. And of course that it was related to their context and that they had positive proactive things that they could do. So this school leader said, we don't have, we asked them, what are your recommendations for other schools? And they said, we don't have answers for other schools because it's all about context. It's not easy. It takes a long time. Our job descriptions describe positive stuff like relationships, helping students, not dealing with problems. They want it framed in a way that would address that very positively, and of course they need to know the context and the understanding. What else did we learn? We learnt that we need to build staff capacity, and we had a very light touch with the sorts of capacity building strategies because they needed to be sustainable. We couldn't be going into schools training face-to-face every single teacher. You see how big Australia is. There's only 20 million people, 25 million people who live there. We're very spread out. It's very hard to reach areas we can't travel to see them. So we designed a lot of tools online, but we kept them really short. Teachers told us that if I'm about to go to a classroom and maybe I'm going to talk about a particular issue, give me a 2-3 minute little Google teacher type message, not a long video that I've got to watch for ages, that just reminds me of the key issues, the most important active ingredients that will make a difference. And you can see perhaps what this school leader said in response. There's probably greater self-confidence in our capacity to make change. This is as a result of this 4 years. And an increased perception that we can challenge behaviours and stereotypes. A lot of the teachers felt that they couldn't, that it was embedded and that they couldn't make change. And they could see over time that they could when they lifted staff capacity, really got their interest. I'm nearly done. The very last component in terms of what we learnt was that student wellbeing needed to be an integral part of the executive role. So think about the principal, the deputy principals, maybe the senior welfare related roles within the school. We would call them student support roles. They needed to see that wellbeing and the way that building children's social skills and reducing bullying was part of their role, and built into their job descriptions, being really clear that that's their responsibility. The tutor teachers, the deliverers of pastoral care, needed to see it, that it was key and part of their role, and that they had an expectation that they would be delivering it. And this school leader said, the pastoral care role from K to 12, that's kindergarten to grade 12, which is in Australia, that's 4-year-olds through to 18-year-olds, has been a real eye-opener. That's Australianism, but I noticed it, for the leadership team. Getting to those behaviours in primary school makes a massive difference to students coming into the high school, and the role that they had between those two environments. Last one. The most important issue again for us in sustaining this change was that they adopt student support and wellbeing activities across year groups, and had a designated location that children could go to, that there was a place that children could go to get help or support, or just a breathe easy room, a place that they can just go and regroup before they go back out again. And providing those spaces was really important, and also enabled the strategies we were putting in place to embed, because they become part of the structure and organisation of the school. This institutionalisation, which is what we want as part of diffusion of innovations. So this school leader said, the pastoral care office is not a withdrawal centre. It's a place for kids to go for pastoral care, and relationship breakdowns are issues to deal with. They're not things to punish. So these were places where children got help and support. They weren't places necessarily where they received discipline as a result of their work. So you saw me have a message in my opening presentation where I talked about eating a frog every morning. And I'm sure you thought, what on earth is she talking about? And this has come from a quote from Mark Twain. And he argued that by taking care of your most onerous task first, at the start of the day, you can spend the rest of your time with more energy and more motivation to focus on less painful actions. So it's that dreadful phone call that you need to make in the morning. You do it first, otherwise it messes up your whole day. So I'd like to argue, what's the frog that we have in bullying prevention? What is it that we need to ask schools to do that will make the most difference, particularly when we look 10 years on from what we had learnt and were describing with the Candlestick Declaration to what we're doing now? One of the challenges that I perceive we have is that people are cherry-picking from programs, but not necessarily based on need. They're choosing the bits that are easiest to put in place, not the bits that make the most difference. So as researchers and practitioners and advocates, we need to be working hard to understand what are the active ingredients in programs, and how are we building the capacity of schools and families and others to make sure that that content is being presented. And as you would see today, I've argued strongly that we need young people to help us do that they have such an important role as part of that ongoing process. So I think we need a Stockholm Declaration. 10 years on, and I had to check that the cherry blossoms are out in your beautiful square, and we checked as of this morning, they're looking very beautiful. What would our declaration be? What would be the statements that we would come together as a result of this 2-day meeting, of having some of the most amazing people in the world who are doing some of the best research we have? What would our declaration look like? And if we go back, if you go online, you can easily find the full declaration of Candlestick, and I put that challenge out to us. What should we declare? What is it that we think is important? And of course, it's so important that we have great clarity in what it is that we think is important, because that clarity means that we get consistency and we get commitment. And that's what we need to make a difference to reduce bullying. Thank you, everyone.
Great. What an inspiring talk. I really liked the perspective of children that you presented. I think that's so important. And I'm sure that you gave many of us ideas how to continue with our research and how to implement methods that can sort of prevent bullying in the future. Thank you so much. So, of course, I also have this present for you. That's a special present for those who perform during this conference. So, here, thank you. Thank you. So now to all of you, I want to remind you that at 10:30 you have various paper sessions coming up, and in the program you can find where they are, but shortly one session is next door and 2 others at the Quality Hotel. So see you there. Thank you.